we're looking at a watch that you don't really see much of, with a movement that you don't really hear much about. It's a fun little watch that I've seen described as underrated and understated. I think that fits it pretty well. If you don't know what it is, it's just another Seiko, but it's got more to it than meets the eye. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. We've looked at a couple of higher end watches on the channel before. Some Grand Seikos and a Tudor. Well, I guess some would debate on whether they are truly high end. But what about high end quartz? There is a niche community of HEQ enthusiasts, and again there is debate over whether the Seiko 8F series of quartz movements should be considered high end. The watch we're looking at today has one of those movements, but in a very affordable package. This is the Seiko SBQK073. I said 8F, right? You might have heard of the 9F before. Those are the quartz movements used in Grand Seiko watches. Those are definitely high-end movements. Fully serviceable, a 2-step motor, decoration, the works. It would be a fair assumption to make that if the 9F is high-end, then the 8F is just a step below that, and I'd agree with that. It has a built-in perpetual calendar, which can account as leap years, as well as, for the price, an incredible level of accuracy. Where some quartz movements are accurate to 15 to 20 seconds per month, this movement is accurate to within 20 seconds per year. This isn't a new watch, you can probably tell by all the little scratches. But that's not what I mean. Yes, I bought this second hand, but actually, this watch is old enough to be in university. Released back in 2003, this watch is 20 years old, but you'd be forgiven for thinking it was released in the last few years. Looking at the style with that integrated bracelet, it's very on trend. I think that just goes to show the timelessness of a lot of the design language that Seiko has developed over time. Another aspect of the design that is very classic and timeless is the dial. So, let's take a closer look there. I feel that the whole watch draws your eye to the vertical center line of the watch, and that starts with the dial. The markers on the dial are mostly rectangular batons, but at the top and bottom of the dial we have something different. We have the 12 and 6 in applied numerals. For me, it's vaguely reminiscent of an Explorer type dial, but maintains an identity of its own. At 3, we can see that the hour marker has been replaced with an applied date window. The date wheel inside is black, color matched to the dial, and in this case I'm happy about that. There isn't a big marker at 9 to balance, so a black wheel looks appropriate where a white wouldn't. Moving further into the dial, below that big 12 marker, we can see an applied Seiko logo. It's a nice touch having it applied rather than printed, another little sign that this watch has received a bit of extra attention to detail. Below the pinion, we can see some printing, perpetual calendar, alluding to the feature of the 8F quartz movement inside. Not to be confused with some more recent 7T86 movements that are also perpetual calendars. Another subtle detail on the dial is the fact that it's actually a black sunburst dial. It's not always obvious and usually looks just like a flat black dial, but when it catches the light you can see a slight shimmer. I'm not always a fan of black sunburst, but I do really like this one. The hour and minute hands are both sword hands and match quite well with the shape of the indices. Seiko got the sizing right as well, with both hands pushing just inside the edges of the hour markers. The hands and indices all have a white strip running down their center. I first thought that this was lume and we'd be able to read the time after dark, but unfortunately, they're not lume. Just some contrasting sections to keep the time legible during the day. The hands are all polished after all, so without those white sections, they could easily disappear into the black of the dial behind them. On a watch like this, it's hard to not talk about the bracelet when we talk about the case, so let's do both. I'd call this watch somewhere between mid-sized and undersized. As with most integrated bracelet watches, it wears a little bit bigger than the measurements would suggest, and I think that brings it up to just about the perfect size in my opinion for a watch like this. We've got a case diameter of 38mm. It sits perfectly between sizes of something like a PRX in 40 and 35mm. Being quartz, the height is very slim at just 9.5mm. Lug width on a watch like this is pretty irrelevant since you won't be changing it out, but lug to lug is quite important, and it's a very manageable 45mm. A problem I had with the watch before, my 9/4 watch's successor, was that the lugs of the watch stretched out too far and made it feel too big for my wrist. Thankfully, this one doesn't have that issue at all. We can see that continuation of the vertical center line going along the bracelet with those polished accents. The case itself is quite simple. We've got a polished bezel surrounding the dial, plenty of polish on the rest of the case too. In fact, it's all polished. It's round until it gets to the bracelet. The sides are quite flat with a beveled edge. It's when it gets to the bracelet that we transition into some brushed finish. The bracelet is quite interesting. First of all, even though it's an integrated bracelet, it's not a smooth transition between it and the case. For a lot of other popular watches, the bracelet starts a lot wider at the case and tapers as it gets to the clasp. This one is almost as if it's finished tapering already. This results in a look that is more like a regular case with a removable bracelet in terms of overall shape. Each link is also quite interesting. It's a single piece link with raised outer sections and an inner polished accent. It creates those vertical lines following the bracelet around the wrist and emphasizes what I feel is the whole idea behind the design of this watch, that vertical line. It's mostly brushed, but the sides are polished to match the case sides. Surprisingly, the clasp is not signed with the Seiko logo. With the higher end movement and other details on the watch, I was expecting the clasp to be signed in some way, but it's very plain. Maybe Seiko thought that adding the logo here would break up the rest of those vertical lines on the bracelet. It's also unfortunately a pressed clasp, offering only 2 holes for micro adjustment. Luckily, as we'll see soon, this watch is just the right size for me, because I don't think I'd have an easy time to track down an extra link for this one. Having gone over the watch, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. It's got a compact case that sits very neatly on my wrist. The lugs and bracelet also point down quite sharply as they leave the case, so that reduces any gaps or overhang that might have otherwise been there. The overall size might be a touch small, but I have been leaning more towards the smaller side of things than larger lately, so I really don't mind that. It's a practical everyday watch, and so the thin height and small size keep it comfortable and out of the way until you need it. So, I do like this watch and enjoy wearing it. It might seem like a plain watch on the surface, but I find it very charming. There is also a certain peace of mind knowing I'm wearing an almost high-end movement that will only be off by a maximum of a minute after 3 years. So, even if the crown is a little small, I won't really be using it all that much. It's also probably the only integrated bracelet I've had personal experience with so far that really feels like it's the right size for me. Some have been too small, but most end up feeling too big for my preferences. What do you think about this watch? Have you come across any of these 8F movements before? Do you agree that this is a Goldilocks size, or would you want it bigger? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.